For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Talking Point. I am Surya Gangadharan. Good evening. I am filling in for your usual anchor Amitabh Brevi, who is away on assignment. This evening we are looking at the Conference of Parties in Dubai, which has got underway today. It's a big thing on climate change, and stock taking is going to be one of the major points of the entire discussion spread over 13 odd days. I have with me Dr. Arvind Gupta, Chief of the Vivekananda International Foundation, also PK Hangzo, Associate Fellow of the Vivekananda International Foundation, both of whom are going to give us their view of the developing negotiations in the UAE. Welcome, gentlemen. Good to have you. Dr. Gupta, this question is for both of you. What would you say are the big issues in Dubai as the negotiations go forward?
So this COP28, as we know, is a annual meeting of all the parties which had signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change way back in the 90s.
Yeah.
So regularly these meetings happen. So this is the 28th meeting in Dubai. So as we go to COP28, I think the climate situation, global climate situation is truly grim. The temperatures are very high, and it is said that this year, 2023, probably was the hottest year ever, maybe in 125,000 years. The CO2 emission level has now reached about 413 parts per million. And this is at least 50% higher than perhaps pre-industrial stage. And the average temperature, average global temperature is likely to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, very soon, the degree centigrade, yeah. And one UN report said that this year alone, because of the fluctuations in temperature, perhaps on 86 days, the global probably average did cross 1.5 degrees, and then it came down. And then you see today we hear the news of extreme weather events, whether it is cyclones or forest fires, droughts, and so on, almost from all corners of the world, including India. So it's a truly grim situation. And 2015 in the Paris climate COP, there was a Paris Agreement on climate change that was signed. So it's an implementation that is being discussed. As you mentioned, it's a stock taking that will happen. So that's the first thing that's going to happen. But broadly on three areas, the discussions will be focused on, as it has happened in the earlier ones. One is the mitigation to reduce emissions. The other is the adaptation, how to become resilient. And the third is how to implement the financial aspect of this. So these are the big three issues that are going to be discussed. And the UAE presidency, Al-Jaber, who is the president of this COP28, has talked about four paradigm shifts that he hopes will happen at the COP28. One he hopes is that there will be a deal on equitable and orderly energy transition before 2030, clean energy. The second is a new deal on climate finance, that means raising the ambitions. And the third is bringing livelihood concerns to the center stage of negotiations. And fourth is inclusivity, getting more and more stakeholders into climate change. So this is how they are looking at it. And I can talk about it a little bit later as to what are the specific goals that he has in mind.
Hangzo?
Yeah. So I think directors are put it very well, but I just want to add that, what I'll be looking at during this COP28 summit is that will the world finally come around? Will they come together to eventually somehow, will we be able to limit the growth in global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius? Because that is the key climate target. And scientists have said that beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, the implications of climate change, it would it will be disastrous. So 1.5 degrees Celsius really is the critical threshold. And that's the key element of the Paris Climate Agreement. And as Director Sir said, this 1.5 degrees Celsius is increasingly, it's, I wouldn't say a lost cause, but it seems so, increasingly. And then what the COP28 summit would do is to look at every country's pledges and then weigh it against the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think the conclusion would be that it's simply not enough to limit the increase in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And now there are lots of reports which say that 1.5 degrees Celsius will be crossed even within this decade, at least temporarily. But then there will come a time when it will become permanent. And beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, the impact of climate change would simply escalate, whether it's more extreme rainfall, leading to more extreme flooding in Uttarakhand or Himachal Pradesh, which we saw recently, and also in Sikkim, the Himalayan hill states, more flooding, more heat waves, for example. So that is what it is. So will this be the one COP that will eventually say, okay, enough is enough, and then let's come up with more stringent pledges so that, the window of opportunity is not lost forever. And I think it's very close to being lost at this point in time. But then again, I'm very pessimistic because looking at the recent round of pledges submitted by countries, and if they are implemented, scientists have said that we will still be at 3 degrees Celsius, even if the current pledges are implemented. So that means we need more drastic pledges, and I think it has to start with developed countries first and foremost. So I'll be looking forward to these aspects of COP28.
So there part of the issue were developed countries, At the end of the day, Dr. Gupta, this is really about diplomacy, hard bargaining, a lot of politics over there, isn't it?
Yes, indeed it is. And you look at just firstly, I'll come to that in a moment, look at the targets. If you have to keep to that 1.5 degree pledges that you talked about, cutting down 22 gigatons of GHG emissions is needed in the next 7 years. 22 gigatons. Every year, the emissions have been increasing. Despite the fact that they have pledged to cut every year, both global emissions are increasing. They are now close to 40 gigatons.
Yes.
So then tripling of global renewable energy capacity to 11 terawatts by 2030. That means so much of investment will be needed in renewable energy. Then there is this doubling of energy efficiency by 2030. So there are many, smaller targets, and each of this requires diplomacy. First, legal, technical negotiations. Then to put it all together, people should agree. And once diplomacy comes, is because these are highly complex negotiations, which are legal and technical nature. But on top of that is, of course, the geopolitics. And entire geopolitics, the world order is central around energy. Economies are energy, everything is energy. So climate change is essentially about energy. So yes, geopolitics becomes very important. And here, geopolitics, those countries become important who own technologies. Those countries become important who produce energy. Those countries become important who consume energy. And those countries also become important who are sinking. Right? Like this war and so on. So they also are stakeholders. Then, of course, ordinary people like you and me, they are also affected. We have no say in all this, but we are affected. So almost everybody is affected. So that is why I think since in the COP is essentially the state governments who participate. So national interests, selfish interests, etc., they come into play. And that's why you see in the climate diplomacy of last 30 years, there is one thing that you can say is hypocrisy. At every level you see hypocrisy. They say something, do something else.
It's politics.
It's politics. In the end, it is all politics. Now you see what's happening. On one hand, you have a major problem between China and the US. The US says that China is our competitor. And now very recently, there was this summit, the summit meeting, Biden and Xi. Now they are coming together on climate change. So today, similarly on technologies. And technologies are also very inherent part of climate change discussions because clean energy and technology, which means what? Which means solar, which means wind, which means critical materials,
Yeah.
which means, all the IPRs, etc., which means the storage, which means sequestration technologies, clean core technologies, and so on and so forth. And who is owning these technologies? Mostly private sector.
Yeah.
So private sector, which has only profit motives, that's its agenda, but they have become very powerful. Trillions of dollars of investment in these technologies is going in clean energy. So I think, yes, diplomacy becomes extremely, extremely important in these negotiations.
So, like any other negotiation, this is like actually any other negotiation where the developed world has an edge, isn't it? They have money, they have technology, and they have geopolitical heft. They can pressure, intimidate. Does that all play out in the negotiations?
Well, you see, they have one additional historical, fact which is in their favor, that they have occupied the entire carbon space. They are the biggest polluters, and they come to these negotiations as clean people, as dispensers of clean technology. So this is why this specific technology, the negotiations, there is also a very important underlying principle of climate justice, which often gets
Lost.
articulated but lost because nobody bothers.
Yeah, nobody's interested.
But I think India has been doing that, and many in the global south also are, because they are not caused this pollution of the past. So this is, yes, so that's the advantage they have. And now, because they have occupied about 80% of the carbon space already, only 20% is left for countries like India to grow. So there is a scramble for this 20% of carbon space. And I think the latest indications are only about, if you have to keep to 1.5 degrees, only about 250 gigatons of space is left. We are already contributing something like 40 every year, only 6 years. And it is in this 250 gigatons that India has its own share for its growth. Otherwise, there's no growth.
Yeah.
So you see how it's, in that sense, it is not an ordinary negotiation, because there are these scientific facts also which are to be taken into account. And all this constriction of the carbon space comes at a time where India is just taking off.
Yeah.
So India has to, diplomatically, very, very alert and careful when it goes into this COP28 negotiations.
Hangzo, Dr. Gupta mentioned historic emissions. And India, in that sense, is not a historic emitter. Can we have some word from you on that?
Right. So, one way of looking at who is primarily responsible for climate change eventually, and also it relates to climate justice as well, is the concept of historical emissions. And that the historical emission generally refers to 1850. That is when the Industrial Revolution started. So from 1852, the latest data says from 1850 to 2019, India's cumulative emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, is just only about 3% to 4%. From 1850 to 2019. Whereas on the other hand, countries like the USA, for example, it accounts for about 25 to 27%, for example. So now, most developed countries, they tend to look at yearly averages.
I see.
Like in that case, India is the third largest emitter last year. After the US, after China, US, it's India. So India's argument has always been that our emission only spiked recently, but if we look at the past hundreds of years, we don't emit that much. And that has to be counted when it comes to liability or it comes to responsibility of doing more to fight climate change. And I think this is often lost, and developed countries are very wary of countries, developing countries bringing out this argument. But I think it's a very strong argument, and also that relates also to per capita consumption.
But in all these years of negotiation, have we been able to get that point home? Have we been able to drive it home?
We are able to drive it home, but not so much to change agendas. Because it is not on the list of agendas that are being discussed. And then but then again, there is some, among developed countries, there is some, there is some understanding of the fact that, yes, they have to do more because they are the one who contributed
the largest
historically. And that And that links up to, the recent agreement on loss and damage, for example, right? I think it was Sharm el-Sheikh last year in Egypt, that the loss and damage fund was eventually agreed upon, whereby developed countries will compensate developing countries on the course of, extreme weather events, for example. It is because of their historical emissions that countries are now suffering. So they will provide funds for them to rebuild, for example. So that's just one element of it. So to some extent, it has become mainstream in a way, and developed countries can no longer ignore this fact. Then they are primarily responsible for emitting the biggest number of CO2 or greenhouse gases in the world, and that has led to the climate, what we have seen, the changes in the climate so far.
So, climate finance, he mentioned, $100 billion was pledged by the developed world many years ago, every year, as funding for climate finance. We have yet to see any sign of that materializing.
Well, the progress has been very, very, insufficient and inadequate. But now we hear that OECD has come out with some report which suggests that in 2023, they are coming very close to $100 billion.
Uh-huh.
Now, nobody knows what exactly is the methodology, etc. And then there is something, earlier they had $80 billion, but there are various kinds of reports. I think there's a huge problem about methodology. But let me just make 2 points in this regard. The question is not of $100 billion. Let's say that $100 billion are available. But $100 billion are available not for free. Are they coming as grants?
Yeah.
Are they coming as
Loans, yeah.
loans? No, most of it is going to be loans. Now, the countries which are vulnerable, they're already debt stressed, under debt trap, and so forth. They are not going to take those loans. And even if they take, their debt situation will become worse. So I think in this COP, there is this also one argument that there should be more concessional finance or grants. So let us see how it comes. But what is $100 billion? That is very small. A drop in the ocean. So another issue which is going to be discussed, and I think UAE presidency has underlined this, that could there be a new deal on climate finance? And loss and damage. And also, you mentioned adaptation. Adaptation is a neglected child of the climate negotiations. Everybody talks about mitigation, but very few talk about adaptation. So there was supposed to be an adaptation fund, but that has not happened. There is no action plan on adaptation, etc. So this is another area which I think India could probably take it up.
So Hangzo, why is adaptation a kind of neglected child?
Number one, it's hard to measure adaptation or the success or the failure of it, for example. And then because, quite simply, the focus on mitigation is due to the fact that, the world is warming basically because of the greenhouse gas emissions. So we want to nip it in the bud, right? If you could reduce emissions drastically, then global warming would
come down
or eventually stop, if you like. So that is the reason why, eventually the solution lies in mitigation. We have to achieve net zero emissions, whether by 2050 or 2070, and that is the only solution to climate change, basically. But at the same time, even as countries are working towards that, the impact of climate change have escalated, and we still need to adapt at the same time, right? So it is a two-pronged process, right? On the one hand, we have to take measures to mitigate to control emissions, and on the other hand, we have to adapt to the ongoing implications of climate change. So, but on the climate adaptation front, adaptation at the end of the day, it's a local activity.
It's a local activity.
At the local level, subnational level, that's when it's carried out. So, in many places, it has become part of policy. India also have adaptation policy, for example. Many countries have adaptation policy. So, but then, the level of our adaptation right now is nearly not enough to deal with future extreme weather events, for example. So it's simply nearly not enough. And we see it in the case of Himachal Pradesh, for example.
Floods and
the landslides, lots of infrastructure being destroyed. So our infrastructure are not climate resilient, for example. So I think the focus should be increasingly on focusing on how can we build roads better? How can we build our bridges better, for example, so that in the next round of flooding, they can withstand the impact of those in a much resilient way.
I'd like to touch upon this use of coal. Now, I think over 70% of our energy comes through coal. And the VIF report that you have been involved with, it talks about using coal judiciously. What does that mean?
by judiciously, I mean not to use coal in a way very carefully, because coal has been seen as the bad boy of, and the focus has mostly been on coal in recent years, right? The phasing down of coal, for example. So in light of that, but India still needs coal. India cannot transition towards cleaner energy simply by ditching coal. It would be energy starved in that regards, right? So a lot of our energy still comes from coal. So what to do about it? So even as we use coal for the foreseeable future, we will also continue to increase the deployment of other sources of cleaner energy, and then over the long term, we gradually reduce the dependence on coal as the other sources of clean energy rises, right? So that balance, I think it's slowly happening, but still very slow, but it is happening nonetheless. And the fact that India has the 4th or the 5th largest coal reserves in the world.
Bad quality coal.
Yeah, and we still import coal.
Yeah.
So what is needed is how best can we use our coal efficiently, for example. And a lot of coal industries are not efficient, right? So the more efficient coal plants you have, the lesser amount of greenhouse emissions, and that's proven by scientific analysis, right? So we need, as our dependence towards coal continues for the foreseeable future, we also have to wisely use, in a very efficient way, the coal reserves that we have. And I think that's the way to for our energy transition.
So coal is a bad boy. India is targeted because it uses so much coal to generate electricity. So does Germany.
Yep.
And they're opening coal plants. How are they reconciling all these contradictions?
Hypocrisy. That's plain hypocrisy. So you see, once energy security becomes an issue, then I think countries will do what they have to do.
Yeah.
And we have seen what happened after the Russia upgrade.
Basically, they look at their interests.
They look at their interests. But they are richer countries, they have more options, etc. But what do you do with other countries? You see, on the coal, today about 70% of coal is being used by India and China. Because we are growing.
Yeah, we're growing.
We are growing. You cannot, deny growth to us. But using coal responsibly, maybe taking a transition through the gas route, increasing the use of renewables, increasing the use of nuclear. That is very important. We have done another report on nuclear energy, where we argue that the share of nuclear energy in India's energy mix is only 1.7%. There's no reason why it should be so small. Nuclear is clean. Its carbon footprint is lower than even that of solar.
I see.
Yeah. So we have to, design our policies in a way that nuclear energy is also given the same kind of equal status as other energy. So coal, clean energies, clean coal, maybe gasification of coal, and gradually don't shut down your nuclear coal power plants just like that. Because
have an alternative in place.
Other systems are not yet mature. So this peaking, you say there is this concept of peaking. And China used this concept, 2030 they said will be peaking, which means that after 2030, the fossil fuel and coal, etc., the share will go down. But for us, 2030 is too close.
Yeah.
Maybe we may have some much later peaking. But there is a lot of pressure already building on India. Do it fast, do it quickly, etc. So that's, I think, we have to.
Has China played this game smarter?
I think they were quicker. And because firstly, they invested a lot in solar. And solar power, solar cells. So the whole world is dependent on China for solar cells, solar panels, so on. I think they went, and other is they completely ignored the COPs, etc. in the beginning. They came to these negotiations in a proper way, and only when they built their alternate systems. So I think, yes, in a way they have, and then their economy has grown. Now they're so big that nobody can
touch there. Yeah. Do we need to build our own climate models? Are we dependent on external models, and does that weigh us down?
Yeah, on climate models, it is interesting to note that, so far, what most countries uses are the ones developed by, let's say, the IPCC, United Nations, so even the USA, Europe. So we use their models to understand the future trajectory of, climates around the world, including individual countries, right? But then what comes out from our report is that climate models are also inherently, it has inequities. For example, many of the models are developed based on developed countries' trajectories, their level of consumption, their level of fuel consumption, or their lifestyles, and those are superimposed upon the developing countries. So our argument is that India needs a model that best reflects its current realities. And there's a debate on that. Some say that, a climate model will take a long time, we need lots of expertise, so why not? We are using existing models, and the best we can do is let's tweak those to reflect our realities better. Because if we continue to use those models, because climate models is not just about predicting what the weather is in the foreseeable future, it's also about energy transition, about the type of lifestyles that that is more climate friendly down the line, so how we can adapt to it. So it's all built into the model. So by adopting existing models as it is, so I think that might not suit the socioeconomic conditions of many countries. And that is the reason why I say that, and not just me, there are many activists who raise this point as well. So there is some inequity element built into climate models as well. So it doesn't really reflect developing countries' realities. Rather, it puts pressure on them.
Let me just give you a small example. We have glaciers in the Himalayas.
Yeah.
There's something like 30,000 glaciers. Very few of them are being tracked. So there is a general statement about
Glacial,
etc. When you are measuring, how are they growing? What is the dynamics which goes behind it? Now we are in the Himalayas. Now we have Western countries talking about Himalayas, but India is not talking about Himalayan. So that is how I think our own models are required. Then we talk about the coastal erosion. We have 7,000 kilometers of coast. Now how is the coast eroding? So we need our own models, and I don't think it is a very elaborate exercise. It's just that some effort has to be put.
But we are slow in this, isn't it? We take time to...
Because, we are dazzled by these reports which come out from the West.
Yeah.
Unless we start thinking about India as Indians and not thinking about India as Westerners have been doing, we will have these problems.
So I want to talk about lifestyle changes, and how these impact on climate change. How important are they?
I think, we talked about hypocrisy, etc.
Yeah.
If today, and there was one lecture I heard of one of our scholars, the Indian lifestyle of using cereals, more cereals, less of meat, etc.
Yeah.
Now, if you do some calculations and how much protein and calorie value, etc. comes in, how much water goes into, etc. If, for the sake of just an argument, if the whole world adopted that lifestyle, emissions will collapse in no time. We can discuss it later, but this is. On the other hand, if we adopt the American lifestyle for India, the planet will destroy in no time. Self-destroy.
Because of their focus on meat.
Because of the meat. Because meat requires a lot of water. Meat requires a lot of energy, etc. Whereas ours are very frugal lifestyles. Essentially, frugal lifestyles, but that doesn't mean that you deprive yourself of.
Yeah.
But these, like our proteins and cereals, etc., protein is produced at a much lesser cost than it is produced in the West. So that is this consumptive lifestyle of the West as compared to the reuse and recycle and use water frugally. Like, for instance, we are talking about millets now. It has become a big movement.
Yeah.
Now, if we had these more sustainable lifestyles, essentially, it's life mission is about sustainability.
Yeah.
So, sustainable practices, and it's not just in India; it's there in Africa or thousands of years.
Yeah.
So, we have to really move away from these highly consumptive lifestyles, which require more energy. Emissions will take care of themselves.
But it isn't happening.
If I may add to that, it is interesting. There is one organization, and I read one of their publications. It is based in Europe, and they track carbon footprints. And according to them, if everybody starts living like Americans, for example, we will need 5 Earths. 5 Earths, all right? And if every countries in the world, if they live like Indians, we will need less than 1 Earth. The current world is enough in sustaining the world. So what this brings about is eventually climate change is a lifestyle issue, right? Now we look at Western lifestyle, for example. So, and I go back to national aspirations that we used to see in Hollywood movies, so, in the pop culture, the American dream, for example.
Yeah.
What does it imply? It implies consumption, bigger house, bigger car. It's all about consumption. So the linking of increased consumption with development, with prosperity, that is what is driving the climate crisis as we know it. So we have to rethink our national aspirations. Countries have to rethink their national aspirations. And now China is talking about Chinese dream.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid, if it's like the American dream, we are done. So that can't go on. So lifestyle change has to be integral to it.
One example, in India, approximately 5 point some people live in one household.
Yeah.
In America, it is about 2. So if we all live like Americans, just see how many what do we require?
Electricity,
and everything else. So in our diplomatic approach, which we talked about, I think, well, negotiations on various things will go on, etc., and we will have our own views and so on. But now that G20 we talked about, climate change, and we have the International Solar Alliance, CDRI, Global Fuel Alliance, etc. So India has got certain visibility and Global South. I think some of these arguments about lifestyle, etc., will resonate with the Global South. And today we have to really make these into movements in Global South, because Global South will never be able to get those
together
standards that the Americans or anybody else has. But we have not been doing that but now we are not that weak. So I think though it's not happening as you said, but that doesn't mean that we should not talk about it. Because these principles, a bad deal will completely destroy. So a good deal in which these principles of equity, climate justice, lifestyle change, these should be brought in. And I think more you talk to people, more people will take it. I think some of our practices have been appreciated by many top leaders.
So my last question, I'd like both of you to answer it. Are we communicating our ideas properly? Are they getting to the right place? Are they reaching the right people? Are we convincing them?
I feel that a lot more needs to be done here. Firstly, we have to convince ourselves.
Yeah.
That's one big problem, because India is not just India.
Yeah.
There are so many people. So we have to convince ourselves. And plus the fact that over the last several decades, the Western lifestyles are completely dominating in mindset. And not only that, the way we are placed in terms of trade, etc., we are importing so much. So ideas are being imported, technologies are being imported. So it's very difficult. But I think by way of example, now the fact that India talked about certain targets for renewable energy by 2030, like installed capacity, but we achieved it 7 years in advance. Now, it's a very powerful movement, a powerful fact, which should be talked about. And this has been noticed by some people. So I think India has to lead by example, not by talk. So we have to see COP28 discussions apart. And we can have all our, issues with others. But we also have to learn to live sustainably ourselves. Efficiency can be increased for the sake of efficiency. Environment can be improved for the sake of environment. Look at what we have done to our rivers, our, mountains and forests and so on. That at least we can start doing it. And this will give us dividends in terms of course, improving the life here. And also by giving an example. And I think one thing which India should start talking about is this GDP as an indicator of everything. Growth, prosperity, progress, etc. is a very wrong indicator. We must bring in ecology, nature, and environment sustainability. So, but in India, how can we communicate these things unless we calculate them ourselves? That's why this question about our own models. And there is a lot of experience, but somehow we have been very lazy in this, not putting enough. And these issues are never issues in our elections. Environment, ecology is never an issue in our elections. How are we ever going to do it? So that's why we are not able to communicate effectively.
Hangzo?
Yeah, I really like the point that Director Sir has made that, environment doesn't feature in our domestic politics. It's never part of election manifesto. At least in many countries, it is. So I think if that if it comes to that, then I think India will be among the biggest player in terms of influencing the climate debate. It already is doing so in many ways. Like, for example, when it comes to renewable energy. So India is among the biggest player in terms of increased number of deployments.
Yes.
It's really fantastic, so to speak. And I think that is recognized by many countries. But then I more focus on ideas, generating ideas. Like, for example, lifestyle change, which for developed countries, it's a no-no. It's a political killer.
Yeah.
They will not raise lifestyle change as a solution to climate change. So because of that, they focus on technology. And even recently, there is an increased focus on blocking the sun by spreading sulfur oxide, and then that will reflect some of the sunlight. Geoengineering, for example, it used to be a fringe idea, but now increasingly it is being discussed. It has become mainstream. So, but even more than that, lifestyle change is important. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi, by raising this issue during the Glasgow Conference of Parties, so I think that's an initial first step in terms of influencing ideas. And I think it's reaching out to people very slowly. But as we said, we need more examples from India, success stories to put out in the world. And so far, I do not know how far that message has sunk in, even in India itself, but it remains to be seen. And if it does sink in, and I think, India's message, it will be very powerful.
So clearly the focus at this COP28 will be more ideas from India. Hopefully we can get a message across and convince the world, especially the developed world, that there's a lot of equity required in climate negotiations and we need to be more fair in the way we go about it. Dr. Gupta, Haozong, thanks very much for your time and a lot of insight and perspective there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thank you.
That's all we have for you on Talking Point. Grab you next week when Amitabh will be back. Thank you very much. Good night.